Elden Ring might be my favorite game. I'm not sure how this happened. It's not the kind of game I thought that I would ever enjoy so much. Most games I count among my favorites I encountered much earlier in life, when they were able to make the strongest possible impact. In my 30s, I found it harder to emotionally bond with a new game the same way I did back when I was younger, when I became completely immersed, completely lost. It's not cynicism. I'm open to the experiences, and I truly enjoy most games that I play. It's just that certain aspects become familiar and recognizable across titles, between developers. There is a language of game design that one becomes fluent in if you spend enough time in these digital worlds. Elden Ring seems like it might check some of those standard boxes. Open world, horse companion, a fantasy setting. It abides by the same basic rules and expectations of play that all the Dark Souls games adhere to, the pattern established with Demon Souls. But it hits different, doesn't it? Even if the structure is familiar, the artistry of it is indeed unique, even from the Souls games that came before it and made it possible. The world of Elden Ring feels completely individual in every aspect. Its mythology, its architecture, its magic, its landscape. There actually is nothing quite like it, which is a hell of a creative accomplishment. Elden Ring takes what Dark Souls was able to build and transforms it into something equally melancholy and evocative, yet more colorful, more playful, larger and stranger by far. The best parts of the Dark Souls games are often in their post-release content. Dark Souls 1 had Artorias of the Abyss, the first of many sad nights to come, along with Manus, the Dragon Calamite, and some of the most beautiful landscape design in the entire game. Dark Souls 2 divided its DLC into 3 massive city dungeons ruled over by 3 lost lords. The Sunken King is the least of them, but the Iron King's lair is one of my all-time favorite dungeons in all of the Souls titles. The frozen city of the Ivory King lingers with me as well. Without them, I would not feel quite as much affection for Dark Souls 2 as I do. They truly do complete the experience and expand it in beautiful ways. Dark Souls 3 had the Ashes of Ariandel, which had amazing boss design and lore, but just okay environmental design. Dark Souls 3 reached its creative peak and the thematic conclusion of the entire trilogy, though, with the Ringed City DLC. Without the Ringed City, Dark Souls 3 is simply not the same artistic experience. It needs the DLC to complete its storytelling. It needs the new environment to explore its themes and hit its full range of emotional notes. Bloodborne was also artistically completed by its DLC, The Old Hunters. Without that terminal stage of nightmarish decay, the whole dreamscape lacks the coherency and bite it has as a unified package. Elden Ring was essentially destined to be the same way. Covering only the main campaign, there are all sorts of mysteries and questions that never arrive at any conclusion, that do not explain themselves well or complete themselves satisfactorily. Even the world map has a great gaping hole in it where it seems like something big and important was ripped away. Well, it was. Shadow of the Erdtree takes players to the Land of Shadow, the missing continent that was magically separated from the rest of the Lands Between centuries ago at the dawning of the Golden Order. Some of what happens is related to what you've done in the main campaign and the present tense of the world, but the vast majority of what Shadow of the Erdtree has to offer is history. The origins of the world's magic, the beginnings of the world's religions, the forgotten participants of its earliest conflicts. It took 2 years for Shadow of the Erdtree to come out, but I think in the end that made it much better for me. I had 2 years to return to Elden Ring, again and again, 2 years to explore, 2 years to ask questions and try to form my own answers. If Elden Ring is a masterpiece for any singular reason, I think it's the game's ability to provoke a profound and meaningful curiosity within its players. Shadow of the Erdtree is equally good at that, if not better. In The Old Hunters for Bloodborne, the world moved into a kind of nightmare vision of the future of Yharnam, the kind of decay that waits within the endless cycles of nonlinear time that world has. Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree moves into the past, and what it finds there is even more beautiful and horrifying. Elden Ring is not complete without Shadow of the Erdtree. Taken together, the combined creative strength of the title is simply staggering. Elden Ring's synthesis of style, mood, and movement make it a modern classic. My favorite games are those in which I feel truly immersed in the world presented to me, forgetting completely about the world of the flesh that I actually live in. And in that way, I guess it is no surprise that Elden Ring has become for me a favorite among favorites, an experience I savored for as long as I could. I suppose that's the sensation that reminds me of playing games as a kid. I never wanted it to end. I was sad to see it go. The irony of all this is that the moral of the story is that I'm a fool for feeling that way. All things move on. All things end. It's when we cling to things and refuse to let them end that the pain starts, a suffering that grew from a small clearing in the land of shadow into the sinister, glowing glory of the Erdtree itself within Elden Ring. Elden Ring has become a comfort game for me. I find it extremely relaxing now that I'm on my 4th major playthrough of the game. Rather than go through another New Game Plus cycle, I began from the top a few months before the expansion came out. Because I was unhurried, I ended up playing longer than I did the first time. And I haven't done that since Red Dead Redemption 2, another game that became an absolute top favorite for me because of the strength and charisma of its art. I wanted to try to really see as much as I could of the original campaign to gain a better sense of context for what would be new in the expansion. Something I really appreciate about Elden Ring is its decisive disregard for realism. The landscape, with its tight proportions that favor scenic layering, high cliffs with nothing but sea and sky beyond, has absolutely nothing in common with how our world actually looks. But it has a dream logic that completely overrides reason. This is how a landscape feels, sometimes, in memory or imagination. Practically, this is for both maximum scenic effect and to divide gameplay spaces into discrete zones. This means that it's not only the regions that look different and feel different from each other, it means that there are major variations and hidden exceptions to the rules of a given landscape incorporated into every corner of the map. As we go into Shadow of the Erdtree, this only becomes more pronounced and intense. There is such a joy of discovery in exploring Elden Ring, such a truly playful touch. I think that's another way it's similar to Red Dead 2 for me. Both were worlds where I became insatiably curious about their hidden facets because each hidden thing was put there so deliberately and carefully. The familiarity I have now with the world made the search for these things more rewarding, and I found them everywhere. I've put several hundred hours into the game across all my playthroughs, more than nearly any other individual game I've played, and I was still shockingly unaware of dozens of points of interest and symbolic motifs that made themselves known as I was poking around this time. Shadow of the Erdtree adds an entire new continent with its own new regions, subregions, and secrets. It's not the absolute most massive open world, but it is among the most intricate of all time. Shadow of the Erdtree adds an even greater layer of complexity. You can't even access the DLC without finding a well-hidden, extremely difficult region, and then finding an obscure portal, which leads to a whole new obscure and difficult region, which then previously dead-ended at a boss fight with a demigod. Now you go through the egg and find yourself in an entirely new realm. It's like the reverse of those Russian nesting dolls. Every time you open a door, it reveals an even larger and more complicated room than before. This opening vista onto the gravesite plains is just jaw-dropping. It was as impressive to me now as the opening vistas of Elden Ring were 2 years ago, but just a little more sophisticated. Which feels like the general experience with Shadow of the Erdtree. If you liked Elden Ring to begin with, Shadow of the Erdtree condenses and complicates the core experience in fascinating ways. For the people who don't like the core game, Shadow of the Erdtree will probably feel much more intensely frustrating because of it. Ultimately, Shadow of the Erdtree worked so well for me because it does not expect or require a great deal of skill to survive and to succeed. It just requires curiosity. It mostly rewards exploration. If you meet the game on its own terms, Shadow of the Erdtree can be, in many ways, downright cozy. And some folks just hate that about it. It's probably worth saying that I had promised on social media that I wasn't ever going to do a video about Shadow of the Erdtree because people responded so overwhelmingly negatively to my last projects about From Software games. I had miserably large amounts of people telling me how disappointed they were in me as a human being, how they would have lost less respect for me if I gave up and admitted that I was too unskilled to play them, how they are my worst videos, how I come across as smug, arrogant, entitled, weak-willed, vacuous, and petty. People hate the videos because they think I'm making up someone to be mad at, and then I get comments by the hundreds to this day from those exact people I supposedly made up, telling me that it's frankly immoral for me to be saying these games can be relaxing and fun because I'm causing my audience to cheat themselves out of the thrill of what the game actually is. The reasons people hate the videos are so contradictory and so venomous that it makes me feel genuinely crazy to read all the comments. I ended up not interacting with people online at all because people wouldn't leave me alone about how I have bad opinions about Dark Souls. I can literally tell when my depression is spiking because when my brain is working normally, it's easy to say, oh, these people are assholes. And then when I'm about to have a complete depressive blowout, it says, hey, maybe they're right. Maybe you are a spineless, weak-willed bag of shit who fails at everything because of their blinding incompetence, which is apparently obvious to everyone in the way that you enjoyed this video game incorrectly. Good job, brain. Really filtering out that signal-to-noise ratio. It's just absolutely fucking bonkers how many thousands of people at this point have said to me that I haven't played the games, despite Elden Ring being one of my actual top video game experiences of all time. It's such a heady froth of gaslighting, insults, and general fuckery. From Software games are wonderful to play, but talking about them online is an actual nightmare, and I would rather not post at all than have to hear about it. But here I am, doing this video, inflicting my opinion on the world again. So why did I break my promise? Well, if it's not clear, because I fucking love Elden Ring. It's the coolest thing to happen to me as a video game critic in years. It's a feast for the senses and some of the best visual art to ever grace the fantasy genre. I ultimately care more about that than I care about all the shit I'm about to get because I have bad opinions about it. Buckle up, buttercups, because not only are my opinions bad, I have a lot of them. Eventually, I'm going to have some sort of opinion or position that people find divisive on a subject more serious than the sad swordsman simulator, and if I can't stand by my work in these lower stakes circumstances, it would be a lot harder to do it when the stakes are higher. So, yes, I did disavow the videos because folks on the internet made me feel like shit about it, but that was a mistake, and I do believe everything I wrote, plus all this new stuff. I meant what I said, and if that caused you to lose all respect for me as a human being, as I have been repeatedly told, there are a million other things to do in this world, and you aren't actually obligated to do the things that you don't enjoy. For many, Shadow of the Erdtree is controversial in its approach to difficulty. There is a new scaling system in place that's based somewhat on the approach Sekiro took, where a player's power curve advanced based on what bosses they were able to take down, often including optional bosses. The new system in Elden Ring is based around exploration instead. 2 materials advance a player along the new difficulty curve: Scadutree fragments that affect player power, and revered spirit ashes which raise the power of your summonable spirit ash companions, like everybody's best friend, the Mimic tier. Players begin severely underpowered versus the new numbers scale, and it is very obviously part of the intended progression path to, use these upgrades that they have hidden throughout the landscape. The new bosses are much more aggressive, with even longer combination attacks than before, making it even more difficult to withstand the sole attention of the enemies without using the spirit ashes or summonable NPCs or summonable players. Almost, like using summons was part of their intended difficulty. However, refusing to use the tools that the game actually gives you is the traditional dogma of many Dark Souls fans, and they argue against their use vehemently. So there was kind of a collective irritation that arose with the expansion because, based on these arbitrary and self-imposed rules, the game genuinely became slightly too hard and was no longer fun in the same way that the base game had been. This has been a fascinating thing to see unfold because, as a much more casual player of these games, I simply did not have these struggles at all. I explored every inch of the map that I could and ended up finding all 20 levels worth of Scadutree blessings, though I fell one short of the revered Spirit Ash maximum. Doing so, the difficulty of the expansion felt intimidating in the beginning, but as it went along, I became equally as comfortable as I had been in the main campaign, equally relaxed. People's refusal to upgrade, and then getting salty about it, became such a pervasive problem that From Software posted a map of where to find the first upgrades, captured hilariously by PC Gamer with the headline, "From Software all but gets on its knees and begs Shadow of the Erdtree players to take their Scadutree supplements." The Blessings upgrade system is different from Sekiro because the thematic mechanical focus of the games are different. Sekiro was about confrontation, accomplishment. You did not get the upgrade bead until the boss was defeated. To become more fearsome, you had to first meet a minimum threshold of fearsomeness. In Elden Ring, player freedom, player customizability, and player curiosity are the primary drivers of play. Almost any build is valid, some are more efficient than others, but the point of all these hundreds of weapons, hundreds of spells, dozens of armor sets, and dozens of Spirit Ash combinations is that a player can craft an experience that has a certain vibe that appeals to them based off of many different mechanical approaches that are all effective in their own way. The more of Elden Ring a player seeks out, the more dungeons, the more ruins, the more bosses, the more choice they have in their customization. This is part of what makes New Game Plus in Elden Ring so deeply satisfying. It takes forever to build up the options in the initial playthrough, but then you can go complete fashion souls as an overpowered, theme-driven character for your New Game Plus. I've seen some players complain that FromSoft expects them to zoom all around doing a checklist before they can play, gathering the Scadutree fragments, but I can't think of a way this would occur naturally without using a wiki to assemble that checklist. If the joy of Elden Ring is in exploration, and exploring is the fundamental basis of the gameplay, then joyful exploration is quite obviously the purpose in arranging the upgrade system this way. Casual exploration will lead a player about halfway up the blessing track, with fragments that are placed along common or mandatory pathways. Deep exploration rewards a player by cranking that dial up further to the point where, towards the end, I was no longer feeling like the underdog in any given situation. Until the last boss, of course. Elden Ring is not defined only by its boss fights. Its unique feature is the scale and intricacy of its open world. The bulk of hours I spent with Elden Ring, I spent out in the world, navigating the outdoor maze of its environments. Never once in Elden Ring or the DLC did I ever get truly hard stuck like I did with the Fume Knight in Dark Souls 2. In an interview that truly ought to settle the matter of playstyle validity for all time, but probably will not, creator of Dark Souls and Elden Ring and more, Hideo Miyazaki told The Guardian, quote, "In preparation for Shadow of the Erdtree, I played through the main story of Elden Ring. I want to preface this by saying I absolutely suck at video games, so my approach or playstyle was to use everything I have at my disposal, all the assistance, every scrap of aid that the game offers, and also all the knowledge I have as architect of the game. The freedom and open-world nature of Elden Ring perhaps lowered the barrier to entry, and I might be the one who's benefiting the most from that, as a player, more than anyone else." End quote. So wow, I guess he hasn't played the game either, huh? What a shame. The way people talk about these games is an absolute farce sometimes, but the games do speak for themselves. They stand apart from the restrictive orthodoxy of how parts of the player base rally around them. Elden Ring does indeed have a much lower barrier to entry than other Souls-likes. It is both more forgiving and more customizable. And perhaps that has to do with why it is so explosively popular. One complaint about the expansion that I do find really valid is a complaint about loot in general. The deep exploration necessary to get all 20 blessing levels feels very satisfying when it results in a tangible boost to your power in the world. It does not feel satisfying when all it results in is what feels like placeholder crafting materials. There are a lot of beautiful, hard-to-get-to places in the game where the scenery is the only reward, which is fine, but the main campaign didn't feel that way. There was a natural escalation through the regions where the materials you found were generally appropriate for your level or interacted with the lore in interesting ways. Sometimes this is true of Shadow of the Erdtree, particularly with plants. Special plants growing in particular places often have something to do with reinforcing the lore and mood of where you find them. But low-level smithing stones? It feels actively anticlimactic. I would almost prefer to find nothing than to have that moment of getting excited only to have it be my 20 millionth mushroom. It's the one frayed edge of the thing because it's the one element that obviously does not contribute to the whole in any meaningful way. What's typically so impressive about Elden Ring is the extreme consistency of the experience, the fact that even the tiniest details like item placement actually influence a player's understanding of the world around them. Most of the detailed lore analysis that people do is based on not only the item descriptions, but the context in which those items are found. They create another layer of connective detail, along with the architectural motifs and in-game works of art. It's not always a strong element of connection, but it's usually perceptible within the main campaign. In Shadow of the Erdtree, item distribution often feels arbitrary in comparison, which is odd considering the fact that the major items in the expansion still work that way. The logic of the item placement in terms of dungeoneering is the same. They are used as rewards for exploration and minor accomplishments just the way they have been since the dawn of the Souls game format. It's just flat sometimes. Weirdly flat here in Shadow of the Erdtree. Which seems like such a slight complaint to spend time on, but when everything usually flows together so beautifully, the dissonant bits stick out more. What's even more ironic is the main complaint in the main campaign regarding dissonance and arbitrary design was about the dungeon templates, how they were indistinct variations which did not often contribute to the whole. I didn't really feel that way about them myself. I enjoyed the puzzle aspect of them very much, and the boss fights at the end of the dungeons were often a lot of fun. I felt like the boss of a given catacomb and such informed the lore well enough. Shadow of the Erdtree, however, seemed to take the criticism to heart. There are fewer dungeons, generally one of each type per region. The dungeons using the catacomb template are slightly more complex than the ones in the main game, but they're overall the most similar. The mazes pick up at the kind of difficulty the late-game areas had. It feels linear to what a player has already been dealing with by the time they burned the Erdtree down. The caves aren't as common of a dungeon type in Shadow of the Erdtree, and the most notable one is less dungeon than it is a direct passage. The only way to the amazing Jagged Peak area is down the throat of a long cave system, the door to the new area appearing once the boss fog lifts. The absolute most infuriating dungeons in the base game were the heroes' tombs, which frequently featured those goddamn murder chariots. Here they're renamed forges and are generally much shorter and more straightforward experiences, which is kind of odd to me. The game escalates nearly everything else, but these are a notable de-escalation of both complexity and difficulty. There are these big smith golems who are meant to be defeated in a prescriptive way. The game uses actual posted messages to tell you that you need to whap them on the weak spot gem on the back. Only having one way to defeat them is fine. I'm just not really understanding why they feel the players need to be told so directly. It's fourth wall breaking in a way other things in the game never are, and the big red gem on the back of the golems seems like plenty enough of a giveaway. For all the complaints about Shadow of the Erdtree being too hard, it has an odd but noticeable ambivalence about fully committing to greater hostility. These enemies are tough, sure, but they're easy to run past. My favorite Forge dungeon has this big corkscrew thing which allows access to some rooms when it's tilted one way and access to the others when it seesaws the other way. It's a great level design concept and the exploration is a ton of fun. None of it, though, was remotely as hostile as some of the dungeon designs in the main campaign, and that came as a surprise. I had this expectation that everything in Shadow of the Erdtree would be harder by default. I hadn't considered the expansion might skew more playful than punishing. It generally does, though. By focusing on fewer dungeons with a greater complexity to the maze-like aspects, Shadow of the Erdtree feels curated, considered, not just content for the sake of it. It's just too bad, then, that all this complexity keeps leading to rooms with glovewort and smithing stones. What's especially fascinating to me about Shadow of the Erdtree is how it references previous From Software titles with its art and architecture. There's a sense throughout Elden Ring as a whole that everything within the game world is kind of a variation on themes and motifs we've mostly seen before. That sense is even stronger in the expansion. While the world maps of both the main campaign and the expansion are new and unique from other FromSoft titles, there are moments and vistas within them that evoke Dark Souls and Bloodborne in a way that is clearly intentional. Sometimes it's even directly obvious. R'hllana is pretty much a new version of Pontiff Sulyvahn from Dark Souls 3, for example. The reference is less thematic than it is just visual, an uncanny familiarity that feels rewarding if you've played those earlier titles. Commander Gaius is a more optional boss, but he seems lifted directly from Sekiro and its early fight with Gyobu Onawa. It's interesting, though, because being able to use the full Elden Ring toolset against Gaius makes the whole thing so much easier. It took me quite a while to figure him out in Sekiro. In Elden Ring, I came in with a heavily upgraded Scattertree blessing and kind of bullied his ass, which was, in itself, a deeply satisfying revenge. It really highlights how opposite the two games are in design philosophy. In Sekiro, the player's power curve is strictly controlled by the linear progression of the environments. Player choice is almost non-existent, but because of this, the combat encounters are all tuned to a very consistent difficulty. Elden Ring allows players to come at a thing either way too early or way too late along the power curve, creating within the same boss encounter like Commander Gaius, a disconnect between players who began fighting him as soon as they found him and struggled, and the players who came back later or came back towards the end, so that the boss balance was reset to be much more lenient and fast. Not knowing whether you're going to feel over-challenged or under-challenged, and the wide variety of opinions about where the line is between the two things, is one of the most meaningfully divisive aspects of Elden Ring. By giving up the directorial control that was baked into Sekiro at a structural level, Elden Ring becomes instead quite colorfully messy. If all those hundreds of weapons and spells are all valid ways to victory, the game has to essentially give up on the idea of restrictive play and prescriptive methods of fighting a boss. This is where the argument about overtuned bosses comes into play. There is an assumption here that players will use what is available to them, including spirit ashes, and so the boss aggression has to be taken to new extremes to try to counteract the player's numeric advantages. Within this unpredictable messiness, accounting for a wide range of player behavior and power thresholds, the kind of consistency of difficulty that Sekiro and the older Dark Souls games had kind of disappears. I can appreciate how that can be disappointing to some players. For me, I love it much more than I'm troubled by it. It's why I find the game so relaxing. Of course, it's not just bosses that feel like murky reflections of past games. The flagship dungeon for Shadow of the Erdtree is Shadow Keep, a dungeon that feels nearly as massive as the entire capital city of Leyndell from the main campaign. For the most part, it's new and unique to this game, but the Specimen Storehouse is this massively vertical part of the dungeon that very much resembles the research hall from Bloodborne's Old Hunters DLC. The way the floors crisscross and interconnect feels like a deliberate echo. The vibe is right, but it's another example of the actual encounter design being more forgiving than Bloodborne. The amount of enemies is not so overwhelming as what there is in the research hall. The sites of grace here in the Shadow Keep provide more frequent checkpointing. The one instance in the game of borrowing something from Bloodborne and making it harder is probably the only time I wasn't actually enjoying myself very much. There is a well-hidden region called the Abyssal Woods, far below where the rest of the map bottoms out. This is a haunted place where the madness of the frenzied flame has taken hold. The Winter Lantern enemy from Bloodborne, a mess of eyes and flesh that fucks you up just by looking at it, has been reinterpreted as a roaming sentry that mostly cannot be killed. I read that if you parry them with a shield, you're allowed a follow-up blow that actually will hurt them, but I wasn't going for shields this playthrough, so it didn't happen naturally for me. There are tooltips all over the Abyssal Woods telling you not to bother trying combat with them. It's mandatory stealth in a big open area where you hide in the tall grass, a la Sekiro. This slows exploration down to a crawl. It creates an entire region that's a rhythmic and mechanical exception to standard play. Now, the new Madness Lanterns aren't everywhere in the Abyssal Woods, but still, it feels like a different game, if only for a moment, and one not nearly as polished as the rest of it. Then you get to the end, and that lack of polish melts away to become something triumphantly considered. Midra's Manse is a much smaller dungeon than most in the game, but it is one of the absolute most atmospheric. Midra's Manse is not a copy or a reference to anything. It is completely unique to Shadow of the Erdtree. Elden Ring, Dark Souls, and especially Bloodborne all use horror imagery and tropes in some capacity, but Midra's Manse is done up in pure, classic haunted house style. The decay, the rot, the hidden passageways behind creepily evocative paintings, the deep background lore about the first appearance of a Lord of the Frenzied Flame, it all hits perfectly. It's a beautifully compact encapsulation of what makes Elden Ring a masterpiece of environmental design and interactive storytelling. And at the end, a body horror twist. To suppress the work of the Three Fingers, the horn-sent inquisitors from Bellerat impaled the scholarly Lord Midra on a barbed sword. His descent into madness and his dalliance with the frenzied flame came from his devotion to a woman named Nanaya, who is long dead in another part of the mansion. She told him to endure, and endure he has, long past the point of sanity. To defeat you, an upstart lord who is going to do what he could not, Midra pulls out the barbed sword and allows the flame of frenzy to ignite, taking him, destroying him, becoming exactly the strange godlike creature you become if you complete the frenzied flame ending in the main campaign. The boss fight is so fun, with gorgeous animations and a wonderfully acrobatic sense of back and forth. Midra is one of my favorite encounters in the whole expansion, all of Elden Ring if you count it cumulatively. It's hard to get a fully concrete sense of what happened, but this is the historical heart of where the madness of the Three Fingers first appeared in the world. Vike is the most recent champion to fall and fail because of the madness, but he comes from this long tradition of spectacular corruption that began with Midra being impaled and imprisoned. Having Midra and this mansion buried at the very bottom of the game world, just like the sub-basement below the subterranean shunning grounds where the Three Fingers dwell, feels equally secret and sinister as that earlier revelation. The Two Fingers fell from above, from the cosmos beyond. The Three Fingers creep up from below to strangle and destroy. It doesn't make logical sense exactly, but it doesn't have to. It's poetic storytelling. and poetic storytelling is more about what is implied than what is stated. One of the most mysterious characters in Elden Ring is also one of the most important, Marika, the primary goddess of this world. Her presence echoes through the actions of her children as they fight over her divine inheritance, yet the goddess herself, when you reach her at the climax, is barely even alive. She is a prisoner of the Erdtree, a calcified statue hung upon the rune arc of grace. Like many other characters in Elden Ring, she is a dual being with a masculine and feminine aspect. You fight her masculine aspect, Radragon, but the true goddess aspect is just a worn container for the divine magic of the tree. She shatters, and from her brittle pieces, the Elden beast is born. Shadow of the Erdtree provides fascinating glimpses into her past and help contextualize everything that's going on now. One thing people hate about my videos is that they think all my lore interpretations are completely wrong, so keep in mind that these are, in fact, interpretations. Like almost all other players, I am making the best sense I can from many disparate details that cohere only in obscure and asymmetrical ways. This is by design. The reason that folks put together 8-hour videos about lore theory is because there is enough room and enough complexity of detail in the many clues given to a player to fill all that time with good, reasonable ideas. But I don't ultimately believe that there is one true, absolute interpretation. The game just doesn't come together like that. There are too many blank spaces, too many instances where dream logic and magical thinking takes the place of following a linear line of history through the world's events. The fun of it is this feeling of just being on the verge of being able to grasp the totality of what's going on. The fact that the truth is elusive in most instances is thematically important and creatively deliberate. If the events of what happened were the most important thing, the game would simply be set in the era where those grand conflicts that shaped the world were still happening. You arrive, instead, long afterwards, in the twilight, along the knife's edge of decay between stagnation and collapse. What makes that mood feel so vivid and so real is the constant sensation of things around you being lost, destroyed, and forgotten. A complete linear history would run counter to this approach and take away from its impact. So characters like Marika become matters of debate as far as what they really are and what they really represent. Marika's godhood seems strange and contradictory, a being of great power and also a prisoner of the divine forces that flow through her. But she was once a woman, not a god, and she was born here in the shaman village behind Shadow Keep. To even find this region, players have to offer a gesture to the statue of Marika, offering sympathy and supplication. This passage leads to the Scataview, one of the most unpopulated regions of the game. Few points of interest, few enemies, but a lot of history for those willing to look. The shaman village is idyllic, picturesque, but empty. A spectral Erdtree grows from the center of town. Elsewhere in the DLC, it is revealed that this whole region and much of the game world in the main campaign was once ruled by the Hornsent, the keepers of the tower, the founders of Bellerat. They worshipped the old original gods and the power of the Crucible before there even was an Erdtree, before Marika was a god. The Hornsent looked very unfavorably upon heresy. Their inquisition is the one that went after Midra and the frenzied flame of the Three Fingers. They were the ones that impaled Midra and left him to writhe in eternal agony. They abducted and killed everyone here in the shaman village as well, not just regular murder. Their flesh was twisted, compacted, and merged into the jar warriors that featured so prominently in the main game. This was a punishment that the Hornsent invented, and apparently a practice that Marika continued even though it was used against her own people. Maybe she felt the punishment was ironic. The other main point of interest in Scataview is the Finger Ruins of Deo. There are several finger ruins, places corrupted by the Two Fingers after they arrived from the depths of space and the outer cosmos. What even is the outer cosmos? Well, this is fantasy and not sci-fi, so it could be anything. It does not have to obey logic, it does not have to make sense, it simply has to appeal to the mythological concept of the unfathomable void beyond what is known or can be known. While not explicitly stated, it seems likely that Marika turned to the Two Fingers as a way to gain power and begin her crusade against the Hornsent out of revenge. Everything in the main game about the Omens, shunned in their dungeon beneath the capital, is related to this ancient war. The whole bloodline of the Hornsent is considered corrupt and cursed. America's animosity towards the civilization she destroyed echoing down through further generations past the point where people even remembered where the omens came from, for the most part. That's kind of amazing, and involves storytelling using deep time and the passage of centuries in a way that even many other fantasy settings do not. Elden Ring, and the From Software world-building method in general, is to give a lot of individual dots of story that require a player to draw lines of connection and inference between them. Like, Shadowkeep is the stronghold of Mesmer, the son who Marika completely forsook when the Realm of Shadow was cut from the lands between. Mesmer never stopped his war. Why? Well, if you've been to Volcano Manor and fought Rykard in the main campaign, Mesmer's big reveal is kind of obvious. The different magical traditions in the game are a huge part of its religion and lore. Rykard's deep crimson flame is associated with a world-devouring serpent and a hunger for conflict without end. Rykard, and the amazing blasphemous blade you can get as a reward for killing him, are just about the only instance where you really see this particular kind of flame within the world. When the mid-battle cutscene starts playing with Mesmer, Mesmer takes out a glass eye that Marika had made to suppress the world-devouring serpent within him, crushing it, becoming the monstrosity that was always lurking inside. You can even find one of these glass eye runes elsewhere in the DLC. Its imagery is a reference to Marika hung upon the rune arc, as you find her at the end of the game. Mesmer's secret chamber and boss room has what seems to be the only statue ever made depicting Marika as a willing mother to Mesmer. He is a secret shame for her, abandoned as an imperfect failure like her children who reflect the Hornsent bloodline. Rykard is proof that, like the Hornsent, the things Marika finds heretical and tainted are part of who she is and will manifest over and over amongst her children. Trying to rise above this legacy of trauma, neglect, and hatred is what consumes most of her demigod children. It is what has driven Miquella to pursue godhood at the price of everything he is, as Marika did, a quest that forms the explicit backbone of Shadow of the Erdtree's plot. Kindly Miquella is an interesting, mostly absent figure from the main campaign. He was the one who created the Haligtree, the strange autumnal kingdom where you find Millennia, the hardest, deepest hidden dungeon of the game, and also one of the largest. Miquella was abducted by Mohg, or it seemed that way, but it becomes clear that Mohg and the dynasty he keeps going on about were a manipulation on Miquella's part. He is a special kind of demigod among the divine children. Miquella has no talent for war, no desire for conflict. He wishes only for a world of peace, understanding, and kindness. But in his pursuit of these things, he corrupts himself. One of the least utilized status effects in the game is sleep, which is, as far as the religious mythology behind the schools of magic goes, the sole domain of Saint Trina. As Radragon is the masculine aspect of Marika, Saint Trina is the feminine aspect of Miquella. They are the same person in the same poetic way, a metaphor made mythic through the lens of fantasy. One of the main NPCs you meet in Shadow of the Erdtree is Tialie, a devotee of Saint Trina. Miquella's great divine power is to captivate and control people. His great rune is holding all the NPCs in thrall, and after its shattering, when the player progresses past various points in the environment, the NPCs all wildly diverge into their original allegiances and motivations. Tialie immediately pivots from serving Miquella to his obsession with Saint Trina, poison in general, and the poison of Saint Trina's sleep in particular. Saint Trina's symbology is interesting because it's most commonly based around flowers. Saint Trina's lily is an extremely common crafting component. These flowers are white, but when you get to the Cerulean coast, all of the flowers are this absolutely exquisite shade of blue. It's one of the most beautiful areas of the entire game, windswept and vibrant, but very melancholy in its own way. Saint Trina's influence is what makes it this way. Down the peninsula is a gap in the rocks, an abyss the player can descend into, called the Stone Coffin Fissure. There's kind of a suggestion that the coffins by which a player travels up and downstream the various rivers in the main campaign are the last vestiges of this kind of magic still active within the world, the tattered remnants of whatever civilization is drowned and buried here along the Cerulean coast. Towards the bottom of the fissure is one of Miquella's crosses. Each cross represents something that Miquella gave up and left behind in his quest for godhood, becoming spectral like so many creatures and characters that you see throughout the game. Usually it's a body thing, his eyes, his flesh, that kind of deal. This cross is different. It says this is where Miquella abandoned his love, emphasized even by a ghost lamenting that this was the one singular thing that he could not abandon on his divine quest. Which is very much a moral of Elden Ring, if it can be said to have clear morals. The quest for divinity necessarily leaves behind those things that make us human. Miquella's interest in kindness and compassion is incomplete and unsustainable without love. He is destined to fail, which St. Trina tells you if you have the patience to listen. At the absolute bottom of the fissure is the Garden of Deep Purple. St. Trina herself is here, and her influence is strongest. The deepest possible magical sleep is what she offers. Death, oblivion, but also tranquility in the way that the vacuum of space is tranquil. Miquella wants to offer compassion and peace as an active thing, a new age of tranquility, but St. Trina's version is deathly passive, the peace of the infinite unconscious, kind of frightening in its own way. To hear St. Trina's words, you must drink over and over from the sap that kills you. Because the rune of death is broken, and even St. Trina's tranquility is fundamentally impossible for one such as your character, all this does is bring you closer to the saint, close enough to hear her say that Miquella's ascent to godhood would be both a prison and a disaster. If St. Trina is the love that he left behind, what does this mean? Does St. Trina know what's happened to Marika? Is the suggestion that ascension to godhood is a literal prison in the same way, hung upon the rune arc for eternity? Or is it that, in abandoning all he was, Miquella also forsook all he could be, and the prison of godhood would be realizing that all that power was just noise and light in an otherwise empty room, devoid of anything that would give meaning to the experience? Either, both. It's impossible to say, and it is impossible by design. This is what myth should feel like: metaphorical, contradictory, irresolvable. So few games are willing to do this, instead taking a lore-centric approach where everything is tidy for the wikis. There is no law in Elden Ring without an exception, no belief without a contradiction. It's a beautiful, evocative mess, and that makes it feel so humanistic in its way. For some plotlines, contradiction is the entire point. The religion of the Erdtree, with the guidance of grace interpreted through the double layers of the Two Fingers and the Finger Maidens, is more or less a reputable fact in the main campaign. You see the guidance of grace, personally as a tarnished. The Two Fingers are everywhere, from the top of the Divine Towers to underneath the hidden Cathedral of Manasceles, where Ranni slays one of the Two Fingers with the blade you steal from her from the lost city of Nokron. The default ending of Elden Ring, where you become Elden Lord, is the only one that continues to believe in what the Two Fingers have been telling you. All the other endings are heresies, preferencing a different divine power. Ranni's has always been the most interesting, because of how many extra areas it unlocks in the game world, and how many extra ideas it introduces to the lore and cosmology. If her goal is to rise beyond and above this world and to take to the stars themselves, this is inherently opposed to the Two Fingers, who have come from the outer cosmos to control events here. The Cathedral of Manasceles is pretty much entirely shattered, but in the Land of Shadow, there is its older, grander twin, the Cathedral of Manus Mater. Ranni rejected the Golden Order and the Two Fingers under the assumption that they were not the most powerful divine force in the world, that the stars and the void are the primary drivers of the universe, and that the inhabitants of the lands between deserve to be among the stars on their long journey into the dark. Inside the Cathedral of Manus Mater is a man named Count Ymir who has diverged from Ranni and the other Carian scholars to become a kind of loyalist to the Two Fingers. As you help him, by uncovering the absolutely bizarre and creepy finger ruins and blowing a great horn at the center of them, he tells you the secrets of the world that you can hear nowhere else in the game. Ymir knows and can prove that the Two Fingers are disconnected from the guidance of grace. They're making it all up for their own inscrutable motivations. Marika and her whole religion are built on manipulation and lies. Count Ymir has lost a child. He has pledged service to the Two Fingers despite knowing this truth because he believes they can resurrect his child or give him the power to do it himself. His throne sits atop the entrance to the final ruins, predating the cathedral by untold eons. It seems like the horn blowing is a ritual to grant him this power of resurrection, and that he intended at the end for you to be sacrificed to his chosen goddess, Mater, the Mother of Fingers. One of the first creatures to ever fall from the sky, one of the oldest beings in the world of Elden Ring, every bit as much of an ancient god as Placidusax in his amphitheater beyond time. But Mater isn't quite as impressive as Placidusax, is she? Mater seems deformed, withered, staring from a single eye in her thumb-like head with an intelligence that seems much more animal than sentient. I love that these interlopers from the cosmic beyond are always so alien in this way, so unlike what one might expect. They are not superior beings, exactly. They are fallible and mortal and weird, just like us. Ranni is such a fascinating figure because she has realized this and decided to just skip to the part where she kicks their ass and goes to invade their home for her inscrutable purposes instead. One of the most important things about mythology in general is how it allows humans to use storytelling to account for the unaccountable and create explanations where none would otherwise be possible. Since we live in a scientific age, there's less of a sense of the world being completely impossible to understand than there once was, but we are still surrounded by mysteries. We can explain the difference between organic and inorganic matter, but still have no clue why some matter decides to just get up and do stuff on its own. Shouldn't everything be rocks and dust, light and heat? The more is scientifically revealed about the universe, the more remarkable and precarious our place in it becomes. Elden Ring's art and storytelling are able to zero in with amazing accuracy on that feeling of being lost in the vastness of the universe, at the mercy of powers and processes that will never become clear or rational. The idea of a god, or many gods, or a world of spirits is helpful to people in feeling comfortable with the universe and organizing it into a functional, workable shape, but there is no religion that accounts for the entirety of what is known or unknown. Even the atheistic perspective is to pragmatically shrug and say, hey man, I'm doing my best here. In Elden Ring, even though the religions and magical traditions are all correct in some way in that they are based on actionable, provable divine powers, are all incorrect at the same time in that none of them are all-encompassing. None even begin to grasp the whole. They are based on lies, or misunderstandings, or half-truths briefly glimpsed through many layers of subjective interpretation. There's such a beautiful feeling of resonance in how Elden Ring presents this pervasive metaphysical uncertainty so vividly and so playfully. Count Ymir cradles one of those crawling hands as if it is his own child in one of the scenes, slightly evoking Ocieros, the consumed king in Dark Souls 3, taking the vague vibes of that boss and making them more concrete and creepy. But once you've defeated the Mother of Fingers, Ymir returns changed. Mage is now the Mother of Fingers with Mater beaten. Her magic is Ymir's to wield. What does this mean? What are the implications? It's a fantastic moment of body horror on one level. It's always deliciously unsettling when a villain enjoys this kind of bizarre corruption. And on another level, it makes the two fingers even more alien than before, so much more animal than divine. But where is the line between what is animal and what is divine? Has Count Ymir crossed it, or is he simply a victim of alien parasitism? Not being able to answer these questions is the point. It is storytelling about the universal human experience of being a small mammal in a big cosmos that will never explain itself willingly, and having to come up with those answers ourselves. That isn't lore, that's poetry. And poetry is a pretty rare methodology for arranging the plot structure of a video game. All of these stories and storytelling methods blend unpredictably with each other, weaving in and out of relevance and focus, depending entirely on player exploration and attention to detail to even tie together at all. Shadow of the Erdtree's world design takes those interlocking pieces and makes their connections mechanical as well as mythic, creating an even more remarkably interconnected play space than they've ever had before. To illustrate this, let's return to Shadow Keep and run down all the different ways it connects itself with other areas. The initial approach is straightforward, through the front doors and up to the main courtyard. There are multiple immediate branches from there. One of the first is a hidden sub-basement where the Jar Warriors are receiving some sort of medical attention. Whether the jars are being stuffed or if this is an attempt to save whoever was inside is unclear. The basement keeps going. Down, down, until it finally opens up on a drainage ditch with a small set of ruins. This seems like the limits of the area, but it is not. The river itself can be followed for an exceptionally long period of time. It leads to many areas previously seen but inaccessible from the earlier parts of the DLC, continuing down even farther until the lowest area where a hidden catacomb can be found, which leads even further down before depositing a player in the abyssal woods leading to Midra's Manse. All of this as a reward for finding a single ladder in Shadow Keep. Another passageway along the main route through the keep leads across a massive bridge. This is the intentional route, meant to be taken after defeating Mesmer. It leads to the overgrown, long-destroyed city of Rao. Rao is the source of scarlet rot. A single chapel began growing these strange flowers, cultivating them, and from this horticultural heresy, the rot spread across the land. Whatever Millennia, Millicent, and her sisters were, began here. There would be no goddess of rot and her apocalyptic flowerings were it not for the buds that bloomed here, long ago. It is not any clearer of a progression of events than most in the game, but it is the explicit origin of scarlet rot, the source of its imagery, the first of the insectile kindred. I've already mentioned the secret path to Scataview and Marika's home village branching off from the Shadow Keep, but it's worth talking about how to even get to that point. There is an entire district of Shadowkeep that can only be accessed from the outside, after descending through a ruined town to the Bonnie village that is anything but Bonnie, crisscrossing over canyons, passing the ruins of the Cathedral of Manus Mater. A player then arrives at the church district of Shadowkeep. You arrive long after the district has been flooded, making it a navigation puzzle that requires a lot of running jumps and leaps of faith. It's an older mode of level design that recalls places like the Shrine of Amana in Dark Souls 2, but the effect is so cool and so moody with the black bricks and splintered wood set against the muddy water. Thorough exploration reveals a way to drain the church district, allowing exploration of all the buildings that were just roofs and rafters to you before. This allows, then, a player to go two directions, up and down. Up leads all the way through the specimen laboratory in Mesmer's Dark Chamber, but it does it by an abbreviated and alternate route. All those little rooms and areas that were tantalizing a player on their first run by being inaccessible are perfectly easy to find along this route. Because it requires a completely different entrance only found by pretty thorough exploration, it is unlikely that this run-through of Shadowkeep will be played near the time that a player does their regular run-through. It brings the whole dungeon back around, hours later, to effectively double the explorable space. After rising to the top, you quickly descend by elevators to the otherwise hidden rear entrance. Only now is Scataview available. The other way leads to the Commander Gaius fight in the altar of the Erdtree. You get a big blessing bonus for getting to this point. The altar itself is just a monument, largely devoid of context. It frames the tree and looks quite intimidating, but what does it mean? While not an explicit correlation, consider what happens if you take the more hidden route down from the church district. It leads to a church dedicated to what looks like the Erdtree, what would be one of the very few in the game. But it is not. This is the foot of the Erdtree, the murky puddle from which it grows. This is where you fight the Erdtree avatar. The Erdtree avatars, common to the main game, are absent in the realm of Shadow. Only the ulcerated tree spirits are common to both. One of which you even fight on the way to get here, as a matter of fact. The Erdtree avatar is much different than the Erdtree ones, where they were more like tree trunks. This is a sickly flower blooming alone in the swamp. Artistically, I think it might be my favorite of the boss arenas. The Erdtree swamp is such a gorgeous mix of beauty and decay. It evokes a sense of things being past a point of terminal neglect and sickness. The fight is a great deal of fun, too. It highlights the genuine diversity of boss fights and environmental artistry that the game has on display. It's not just sad nights, though they are quite important. It is willing and able to create fantasy landscapes and moments of conflict that stand on their own, apart from context, that evoke a whole range of emotional responses without ever quite understanding their thorough meaning. This fight, in the true church of the church district, is built on vibes alone. Would it be better with more explanation? I wonder, with stuff like this in particular, if more concrete narrative setup would create a deeper feeling of investment. I want to know more about the Erdtree itself, what it is, what it represents, why it is, and what it wants, but suppose I did get what I wanted, and the answers then were slight or insubstantial. Based on mood alone, this moment and place are mythic and impressive. Context could diminish that, make it plain, make it familiar. It's the beautiful surrealism of it that really hits. It's the invitation to draw my own conclusions and make my own meaning. I feel as if a concrete answer would weigh that down, and I've laid out my reasons. Sometimes, though, I can't help but crave something a little more tangible. Consider one of my favorite regions in the game, the small but dense area of Charo's Hidden Grave. I have tried my absolute best to figure out who Charo is, and I am still stumped. It's an upper tier of the Cerulean coast, where some kind of magic has turned the flowers from blue to a vibrant blood red. I want to know what kind of curse it is that the flowers themselves reflect violence. It seems to have something to do with the deathbirds, but it's vague. Too vague to cohere into a meaningful understanding of what is meant by this particular slice of artwork. This is the fine line that the game walks with its storytelling approach. To be completely devoid of any context risks being unable to evoke the intended emotions. The poetic elements need to be able to suggest the context that isn't directly supported by fragments of lore. But the fragments of lore are so critical to the feeling of there actually being a unifying rationale behind everything, the pieces of the shattered urn of history that can be held up and glued together to imagine the whole. Without enough fragments, the sense of there even being a whole remains elusive. They are ideas suspended in a vacuum. Like an engine starved of fuel, the creativity sputters and slows when there's not enough given to the player to work with, or especially if those things do not end up cohering in a satisfying way. In some ways, ironically, Shadow of the Erdtree has a more direct and exposition-driven plot than the main campaign. Miquella, in his bid for godhood, needs a consort. This is a kind of ritualistic requirement for most of the contenders to the divine. Ranni asks the same of you, after all, if you help her kill the two fingers lurking underneath Manus Celes. Mohg wanted it to be him, but Miquella never truly wanted Mohg in the role, just his body. In a strange ritual conducted at the height of the city of Nir Ilim, at the Gate of Divinity, Miquella will place the soul of his brother Radahn into the body of Mohg and resurrect him as he was at the height of his power, before the Scarlet Rot, when Radahn was so powerful as to stop the stars from moving in the sky. Not a bad candidate for consort, pretty decent idea, can't really get a more fearsome warrior if he tried. And oh did he try. Before you can fight Miquella and his resurrected Radahn, you have to fight most of the NPCs you've met in the DLC. Leda, the Needle Knight, is a puritanical believer in Miquella and hunts down the others. Only player intervention can save Ansbach, the Hornsent, and Tialier. The other NPCs desire battle or glory, even just the approval of friends, and so all band together against you. It just doesn't feel like a satisfying resolution of these characters. It feels impersonal to have them all band together this way, just to keep you from your goal. It negates much of what made them distinct while you were learning their stories earlier. And then, the big finale. The hardest fight in all of Elden Ring. And fuck is it difficult. Radahn here is absolutely relentless. About a third of the way through the fight, Miquella comes through the Divine Gate and joins Radahn, adding his powers to his brother's, dialing shit up another notch. On the one hand, the fight is so special and unique, it has a completely unique way to die. In this later phase, there's a grab attack that does no immediate damage, where Miquella whispers promises in your ear about his kingdom of peace. If he grabs you again, you lose your free will to him and bow down in supplication, losing instantly as Heart Stolen displays on the screen. Fucking amazing. I love it. They've spent hours telling you that this was his special power, and it actually is, in a mechanical, tangible way. That's great. The problem is that this moment is constructed as a boss fight only. The contender to godhood versus the contender for the Elden throne. Nothing is revealed about Miquella's personality or motivations that are new. The action is the point, and the action is, for once, effectively self-justifying and surprisingly lacking in both lore and context. Consider the gate itself and this city. The city of Nir Ilim is hidden in shadow above the tower town of Bellarat by magical seal, a seal you break as soon as you're done fighting your way through the Scarlet Rot Chapel. The way you get here is a parallel equivalent to burning the Erdtree and getting transported to Farum Azula, with the same kind of significance. The city itself is one of the most lushly detailed, impossibly proportioned places ever put in a From Software title. It is absolutely the top of what they can do in terms of level design. It's massive, it's gorgeous, and the devil is in the details. Strange statues of tentacles and faceless gods, trees made of mangled, twisted corpses, and the higher you climb, the clearer it becomes that the stone itself is made of the dead and dying. It is a little unclear whether these corpses are trying to cling to the buildings or if they are becoming the buildings, but the effect is similar. The Divine Gate is the absolute apex of the city, the apex of this religion, the city of the Hornsent, the lore of what it even means to become a god in this world. It is a place that is deeply, deeply important and critical to understanding the lore of Elden Ring and the story as a whole. And it remains mysterious, mute. It would be up to NPCs like Leda or Mikola to explain it, and yet they don't. They focus only on the threat and challenge that you represent, the conflict between you and the boss that is inevitable. Nothing else seems to matter beyond this present tense of the experience, which is so frustrating when what is important to me here is history. Getting my ass kicked over and over and over again, this is fine. I expected this. I actually signed up for it willingly. That's the agreement a person makes with From Software games, that sometimes it's gonna be a serious pain in the ass. It's part of the fun, until it gets tedious, which can certainly happen. I'm not sure if I feel that way about it here completely. I preferred going in with a party of other players because that seemed like the most exciting climactic way to do it, and other players helped a ton with the Mesmer fight for me. But the extra health that Radahn gets from the presence of other players does make the fight much more brutally long. I feel like the fight is something that's going to vary wildly from player to player in terms of getting what they want out of it. It seems like this would be particularly rewarding to solo players because the pacing would be improved, but it's also particularly dangerous for players like me who base their playstyle around distractions and magic. This fucker simply will not be distracted. I don't think that the fight itself is disappointing, but the climax of it certainly is. To beat him feels good, a major triumph, a testament to having withstood the most aggressive enemy Elden Ring will ever throw at you. This mechanical climax works as intended. Then it provides a tantalizing flashback. Mikola, much younger, on his first steps towards godhood. He asks Radahn to be his consort, and that's it. A brief memory of something a player already knows and has already been explained, over-explained even by the standards of Elden Ring's typical storytelling. Here is the final victory at the tallest heights of the world, at its most ancient secrets, and those secrets feel less tangible than even the ruins of Farum Abzula. The Beastmen, the storms, the hidden fight with Placidusax, that was all substantially better foreshadowed and telegraphed, much better explained by the item descriptions and lore fragments you found. This climax left me hanging. And perhaps most disappointing is that the expansion does not add a new ending for the main campaign, at that final moment where a player is allowed to choose from among the runes and other options they had prepared for the epilogue. I fully expected another rune, a new ending. Instead, Mikola's broken rune only helps prevent him from stealing your heart during the boss fight. In many From Software DLC campaigns, there is a sense, at the end, of having achieved a kind of beautiful synthesis with the main campaign. They are blended in a way that feels purposeful and climactic. Shadow of the Erdtree ends with a sense of a side story having been drawn separately and privately to a close, isolated as much within the script as it is by magic from the lands between. There is something missing, but perhaps that's intentional. Chasing the feeling and trying to find greater closure sent me right back out into the map, wondering and wandering. Plus, if you ever feel like you haven't gotten the most out of a boss fight and wish you could replay it, there's an incredibly easy way to do so. Be a summon for someone else. You can help an infinite amount of strangers with something they genuinely need help with. I liked Mesmer's fight a lot, so I spent a few hours as a volunteer NPC. The atmosphere was great. People waving, almost always summoning the full 3-person party. There was a sense of great cooperation, and a sense of humor besides. You see a lot of player deaths doing it this way, and it can be kind of sympathetically hilarious to be trying to help someone who's making all the same mistakes I always do. When people talk about how player summons beat the game for you, this is so rarely true, especially with how overtuned these DLC bosses are. Among the wide player base, at this early stage at least where everyone is devouring the game at once, you're just as likely to get someone as clumsy as you are to get a ringer. It's chaos, unpredictable, and joyful. Just looking at a random cross-section of the player base reveals so many different variations in weapon choice, aggression levels, costuming, and theming. People get so creative and playful with their characters, and I love to see it. To have created a game where all these styles coexist within the same game structure as everyone else at the same time is genuinely remarkable. The rough edges, the places where the elasticity of the game systems can no longer keep up with these variations and some players fall through the gaps, these things are not so overwhelming as to diminish the amazing accomplishment of everything that the game does achieve. I feel like I could go on for hours about the stylistic choices I enjoy, about the lore theories I have, about the many individually memorable instances of triumph or terror or error. And I certainly have gone on already. Discussing the surface details and the anecdotal details brushes past the core of what Elden Ring really is and why it works so well. It is not primarily an action game. It is a puzzle game. It makes a puzzle out of every single element of interactivity. The combat is a puzzle, as the Souls games always are. It is a legible, impressively dynamic dance of action and reaction, the player reading the computer's movements, the computer reading the players. Fights in Elden Ring always look so fluid compared to other action titles, and this is because of how they are paced as a kind of violent conversation. One combatant speaks, the other responds. The puzzle is in how to make the correct argument with your violence, the right verbs in the right order. Every puzzle can be solved in a million different ways, even, if you want, without upgrading the blessings even once. Elden Ring's combat puzzles can be solved with more complex answers for more complex players, but it will accept nearly anything so long as you are genuinely participating in the thrill of the moment. It makes a puzzle of its story and world building, giving clues, leaving uncertainties, expecting the player to determine the shape that the puzzle resolves into. The diversity of answers with which people put together the information is just as varied as how people approach the combat. Elden Ring makes a puzzle of its landscape, teasing players with areas that are obviously explorable somehow, and then providing that answer much later when it isn't expected anymore. There is a playfulness and creativity in the organization of the world map, both for the main campaign and the DLC, but particularly for the Land of Shadow, that is absolutely unmatched. The macro-exploration between regions of the overworld map and the micro-exploration of the game's traditional dungeons are functionally indistinguishable from each other. They each invite a player to explore meticulously, room by room, following each path to its end and ferreting out every secret a player can find. This is a game where, combined now, a single playthrough can take up to 200 hours, and not a single moment feels wasted. There are things I would have preferred in some instances, things I might have enjoyed better, but I was engaged and immersed by every moment. Frankly, I'm resisting the impulse to just do it all again on another New Game Plus cycle. It has become, completely against my expectations, my favorite. Shadow of the Erdtree just solidifies that for me. It is everything I loved about the main campaign of Elden Ring 2 years ago, made more complex, bolder, and brighter. And if the expansion would not provide me with a satisfying climax, I just created one myself. One plotline a lot of people were hoping the DLC would follow up on was that of Godwyn, the first of the gods to die, the source of much of the corruption in the world. Shadow of the Erdtree does follow his plotline, but not very explicitly. At the bottom of the catacombs, instead of the Black Knights of the main campaign, are Godwyn's Death Knights. They are predecessors to the Crucible Knights that served him later, stranded here in this older place. Mesmer's Black Knights are related to them somehow, though it isn't really clear how. The Land of Shadow is where all of it began. The Scarlet Rot, the Frenzied Flame, the Golden Order, the Jar Warriors, the Fingers, the Wars, the Myths, the figures that would shape the world before, during, and after the shattering of the Elden Ring by Marika. Who is right? Is it Ranni, who wishes to abandon this realm for the cold and unknowable void? Miquella, who wanted peace at any cost? The Fingers, who wish only to further their manipulative control over the Erdtree Church? Or Godwyn, who wished not for one ending, but for all endings, for life and death to fall back into their traditional rhythms, for the gods to become mortal, and the mortals to find greater meaning in what they do? My time in the Land of Shadow made me reflect on how false divinity often is in the world of Elden Ring, and so I chose to become a devotee of Godwyn, to trust Fia that this was the compassionate choice, that the mending rune of death that she created from the tattered remains of Godwyn the Golden would indeed mend the world. Was it right? No. There is no more singular true version of right and wrong within the game than there is a singular true interpretation of its history. We do our best to make sense of the clues given. We determine our own path and believe in ourselves to choose according to our own values. So if the game would not complete Godwyn's plotline explicitly on its own, I would do it myself. I would assemble my own narrative from the tools provided, just as I had assembled my own paths to victory in the many hundreds of combat puzzles. Perhaps that's even the central catharsis of becoming Elden Lord at all. It is a testament to the player's own curiosity, their own patience and skill, and most of all, their own sense of self-determination. For Miquella, the price of divinity is to lose everything that made him who he was. For the player, it is a moment to reflect on the very real, very human impulses that brought them from a lowly tarnished to the highest throne. I love Elden Ring so much that I don't ever really want to leave it behind. But that's not the lesson taught by the parable of Godwin the Golden, is it? It is right for things to end. Even the most glorious things die, and we should let them. Death gives value to the time that we have, and when it comes to video games, few pleasures compare to the sense of having spent that precious and finite time on something that truly mattered. Thanks for watching.